Hello and welcome to this episode of Academy21's podcast. Within this episode, we've curated some insights from our webinar at the start of this year that we think are worth revisiting. Together, we'll unpack the term inclusive by design and how that applies to relational teaching, but crucially, without compromising academic rigour. Our head of Key Stage 4, Ray Boxall, a colleague with a rich knowledge of SEND and assistive technology, will talk us through how we innovate our curriculum through the use of technology, leaving us all with his top tips.
Thank you very much, Amy. So I'm Ray Boxall. Like Amy, my background is in bricks and mortar education. So prior to my time here, I was a deputy head teacher in a school in North London in charge of inclusion and pastoral care. So great to make the transition over to online, but good to have a foot in both camps, I think it's fair to say. Thank you very much, Amy.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ray. Okay, so to get us started today, I thought it would be a really useful discussion to start off with a brief explanation of some of the key terms that we use in the SEND landscape. So the three key terms that I'd like to unpack with you today are differentiation, adaptive teaching, and scaffolding. And I think many colleagues will agree that sometimes we hear these terms used interchangeably. And I'm wondering, Ray, would you mind just walking us through the nuances to each of these terms?
Absolutely. More than happy to. So let's begin with differentiation then. So by differentiation, what we're referring to here is a term which is often about what the child undertakes as an activity in a classroom setting. So this will involve planning different learning tasks and resources for different students. So this was very much the prevalent approach when I first began teaching, and certainly for the first half of my career. It certainly has its place, but there's some feedback that we see in the sector. There's sometimes that differentiation as an approach can perhaps limit the expectations that we have of students, or maybe even entrench differences. Adaptive teaching then, by contrast, is more about how the teacher delivers learning experiences. So it's a responsive, real-time approach whereby teachers use their skill and knowledge to make adjustments for their students. This can have a proactive component. So there are things, of course, that we can anticipate with our expertise and our knowledge of the young people with whom we're working. And it can also have a reactive component. So things, of course, that we will need to do on the fly, go into our teaching toolkit, as it were, and then do. Finally, then, scaffolding is that process of breaking learning down into accessible, manageable steps. So again, we could do this through our planning, and we could do this live in class. So to give an example, I'm an English teacher by background. So a scaffolding approach to a lesson where I'm teaching some lovely Shakespeare might involve pre-teaching vocabulary that students will need to access. So a key term like what is a soliloquy, for example. It'll involve chunking that text and thinking about giving it to students in chunks that they can manage. It'll involve modeling any answer that we provide and perhaps providing writing frames so that students can access their work. So there we go. They all have their place, but they are essentially about breaking down learning for students.
That's really, really helpful. Thank you, Ray. And a useful reminder of not only their differences, but how each of them does have its place in a truly inclusive provision. I think when you spoke about adaptive teaching, this is particularly relevant for Academy21. It's why we're really proud to say that we're live online alternative provision, because through being live and those interactions with our students, by necessity, we are able to be adaptive in our response as teachers to shift and move and adapt to what the students in front of us actually need. So we have a question that's just come in, which follows on actually really nicely, Ray, from what you've just been discussing. So when we use the phrase inclusive by design, obviously, this is a concept that we fully embody at Academy21. And when we say inclusive by design, I think it would be really useful for listeners to get an understanding of what we actually mean in terms of this phrase, particularly in an online context.
That's a great question. So our inclusive by design approach then essentially encapsulates our philosophy of designing and curating students' inclusive learning experiences as a fundamental part of our thinking, okay, rather than perhaps as an add-on. So it's been great to see discourses emerging at the moment in the the education press and so on around thinking about how we have to, we've got a large number of young people with additional needs, 1.6 million. So we need to start thinking about them as a fundamental rather than as a separate cohort of students who need something different, so to speak. So in terms of what inclusive by design looks like, then I'm going to use an analogy which I hope will be helpful. So if I were to say to you, what might a physical bricks and mortar school look like if we imagine in our mind's eye, that is inclusive by design in it, but both in its environment and its teaching, we might be thinking of things like we might be thinking about things like ramps as well as stairs. We might be thinking about braille signage, sensory rooms, thoughtful use of acoustic space so that students with sensory needs aren't overwhelmed. We're thinking about a teaching approach that is kind and thoughtful to things. I'm sure, in our various capacities, whatever our roles and wherever we're coming to this from, we can imagine that. Now, in an online environment, it's possible to do this too. So what we do is think really carefully about removing what we call friction. So friction being when students in an online learning environment might get a little bit lost because there hasn't been due thought to accessibility, to making the learning resources and pathway in their lessons flow nicely. So, but in other words, by inclusive by design, we mean removing friction, providing flexibility and support for young people, essentially.
Great, couldn't agree more. Thanks, Ray. When we talk about being inclusive by design, we know that this also applies to our teaching approach. So, for example, Academy21, we root ourselves in a practice which we call relational teaching. And when we say this at Academy21, what we mean is that it's the imperative to centre all of our teaching around relationships, around connection with our students, and a really sound understanding of child and adolescent development. So in our context, many of our young people who access alternative provision or AP, like ours, they've often experienced a lack of success in their previous education journey, whether that's a temporary blip or it could be a more long-term issue. Sometimes it's through attendance, it might be participation and engagement, it could be mental health challenges, for example. But the commonality here, and this is the crucial bit, the commonality is that this often results in low self-esteem for our learners. And it won't be new information for people on the webinar today that low self-esteem can manifest or present itself in quite challenging or dysregulated behaviour, or behaviours that come across as perhaps a little bit defensive from our young people. When we reframe the lens through which we look at a student's behaviour and the way that we interpret that behaviour, when we start to scratch the surface and look at what lays beneath that, teachers can really start to develop meaningful connections with their students. I think this is a really relevant point for pupils with anxiety and other mental health challenges as well, that make crossing the threshold to a mainstream site feel like an impossible task. So you'll have no doubt heard the term ESBA, or emotionally based school avoidance. And this can feel incredibly isolating for our young people and their families. And I know from experience, it's often left me as a member of school staff, as a head teacher, as a deputy head in charge of inclusion. It's often left me feeling a little bit unsure of how best to support, what is out there, what's available to support children and young people who are really experiencing those challenges in actually attending the school site. And in terms of a student's experience of success, I think this is, it's pivotal in reframing their own inner narrative about what they're capable of. So when a student is given opportunities to succeed, and that is regardless of how big or small they are, it really promotes a growth mindset in our young people. So in order for this experience of success to be at the root of inclusive teaching, it's about noticing the good. And again, that's not new information. It's something that we're always encouraged to do, but it's a really useful tip to keep that at the forefront of your mind, particularly if you're in a role where you have input into the CPD of teachers and early career teachers and support staff, is making sure that we're constantly reiterating the importance of noticing and commenting when a child or a young person has been successful in something, no matter how big or small. It's looking for every opportunity to praise and to celebrate our students. It could be something as innocuous as, they've contributed to a class discussion for the first time. In our context, it could be that they've, attempted to answer a question on a poll for the first time. They may have helped a peer with a question. You might simply be praising their attitude and their effort. And over time, this will shift their inner narrative, and it will change from being sort of self-limiting belief about themselves and what they're capable of to an inner narrative which says, I can do this, and I've had experience of being successful before. And our students probably won't be thinking about this at a conscious level, but it's very much the kind of emotional memory that is laid in the brain when we've had repeated experience of success. So we've been asked for some example of lesson strategies that naturally include all of our learners, rather than adding additional layers of differentiation. So this links to what Ray was talking about earlier in terms of when you are inclusive by design and you're able to preempt a lot of those scaffolds and needs that your students will require in order to access the lesson and crucially to succeed in the objective. There's all sorts of different things that we can add on, we can tailor here, but really being inclusive by design should minimize the need for additional layers of differentiation. So I'm going to talk about this, I think, from a relational teaching perspective. So I would say, in terms of my key point to this question, how I would start the ball rolling in terms of relational teaching approach, it's about how our classrooms, whether they're virtual or physical, how our classrooms are set up to promote positive relationships and relational teaching. This will benefit every single student. So this isn't specific for students with SEND. It will have knock-on benefits for everybody. And establishing the basics is crucial. So in many ways, I'll be teaching you to suck eggs here, but I think we sometimes can't overemphasize the importance of the basics enough. And so I'll just run through what we would consider the basics at Academy21. So knowing your students well, really establishing that connection early doors, knowing their preferred names, for example, their preferred pronouns, pronunciation of their name. So we had a really lovely example recently of a young man who, when the teacher asked if we were pronouncing his name correctly, he smiled and he looked quite pensive, and he took a few beats before replying, "That's the first time anybody's ever bothered to check." And I thought that was such a powerful thing to say and a powerful glimpse into the lived experience of that student and the impact of just that personal positive connection that a teacher has taken time out of their day to check that they're pronouncing a student's name right. I think it's such a fundamental but a simple thing, but it can mean the world to an individual student and change the way they feel about accessing that particular lesson or the relationship that they have with that particular teacher. And asking students questions, building relationships, the personal touches. So for me, things like referring back to conversations that the student has had with you about maybe their weekend plans or something important that they've told you that's significant for them. If you refer back to those things, it lets them know you've held them in mind and that you have actively listened to the information they're sharing. I think body language is crucial too. So having open body language, warmth of, facial expressions, the intonation in your voice, all of these non-verbal things lead a young person to feel either safe in that relationship and that connection, or leave them to feel a little bit ambiguous and unsure. And so the more concerted effort we put into our own practice and in terms of the way we teach and the way we present ourselves, it's a fundamental strategy that I would encourage everybody in every setting, virtual or physical, to employ. So Ray, would you be able to walk us through how we innovate our curriculum and how we innovate our teaching through the use of technology? Obviously, we're an online setting, but I know that a lot of what Ray will have to talk to you about with his depth of expertise will be applicable to physical classrooms as well.
Thanks, Amy. I'm glad this has come up. As a leader in an online school, as you may imagine, the use of tech tools to support learning is one of my favourite subjects. But I'll so here are some things that we do, but I can see how these would work in a bricks and mortar setting also. So firstly, I know one thing that's been very transformative for us over the last couple of years is teaching the use of particular accessibility tools. So let me give you a couple of things that we do that will translate and work elsewhere. So, for example, one thing is teach students the keyboard shortcuts on their devices for speech to text, but also, moreover, how to use that responsibly and perhaps not overuse it, depending on the assessment objectives and the rigors of whatever course that they're doing. But nevertheless, important to teach that, and I think that can work very well in a bricks and mortar setting too, to reduce the cognitive load and take off the amount of writing and the speed of it, perhaps sometimes. Also, moreover, when it comes to reading texts, so Lakshmi gave the example of we often provide recordings. One of the other things that we often do is we teach our students how to use Microsoft Immersive Reader. It's fantastic, not only for dyslexic students, but also for students with a range of needs, or indeed none, in fact. It's just so useful to see a Word text or another Microsoft app text be translated into a format where all of a sudden you can focus on a line or 3 lines at a time. It can be read aloud to you. The word spacing can be stretched out. The background can be pastel colored rather than glaringly white at a touch of a button. So that's something that is widely available on whatever devices we're going to be using in an online or a physical setting, that can really transform how well students engage, because all of a sudden they're not distracted or being challenging, because they're actually finding the resources a lot more easy to engage with. So that's really, really important. Also, I'll just give one more exciting example about the use of tech that's been well received in our setting, and I think it could be used elsewhere. One thing that we often encounter with our older learners with additional needs is that they desperately do want to take good notes, but they can find that overwhelming. And one solution that we've been using is having an AI assistant listening to a bit of exposition in a lesson. Obviously, we'd use that responsibly. We wouldn't want everything to be kind of transcribed, as it were, but perhaps a key part of a lesson. And using an AI assistant can not only listen and transcribe to what a teacher says, but it can summarize in live and turn it into bullet points for the students, so that they can more fully attend and concentrate on what the teacher is saying and be formulating their next question, or thinking about what they're going to do next, or more able to attend to some instructions. So there are 3 examples there which I hope are applicable to any setting, that can really reduce that cognitive load and promote some engagement.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ray. Really, really helpful. And I think when I listen to you talk, it's as much about embracing technology as it is about, innovating. And I think particularly for our young people growing up in the world that they've grown up in, technology is something that they're incredibly comfortable with. And sometimes, I don't know whether listeners will have had the same experience, but sometimes it can feel a little bit daunting to learn about new technologies, to implement them in your teaching. But we just need to take a step back and remember that it can be daunting for us, but our young people will no doubt have a lot of confidence in terms of technology. And so thank you, Ray. That's brilliant. So before we end, I'd just like you, if possible, Ray, to summarise in terms of scaffolding and success, if you possibly can, could you summarise it to your 3 top tips?
Thank you. Yes, I've had a good think about this, and I'll do my best to be concise and cogent here. So firstly, my first top tip would be to teach and integrate accessibility tools very, very deliberately, both through staff professional learning and through teaching the students themselves, and then signpost. So in our slide decks, when we're presenting, physically around the school if necessary, referring to in our teacher talk. So that's my first tip. Do teach and integrate the accessibility tools, because it'll take some time to integrate them, and do that and curate them very, very, very deliberately. My second one, then, to summarize our top tips, is that active thought about the design of resources and how they flow, as we saw, for example, in Lakshmi's demonstration. So thinking about the register of language that we use. I'm going to give an example I often use to colleagues in training and when I sometimes speak at conferences. Sometimes I'll give an example from Key Stage 5 learning here. We might read something like, this type of result is not uncommon, I've been told, is a wording that drives SEND learners absolutely mad. It drives me mad. So, sometimes without thinking about it, we can forget to be concise in our register of language or with the amount of text that we put on a slide or the reading age. As we know, we're in this exciting era now where it's so easy to pop something into a large language model, responsibly. So it's very easy to just translate a reading age or to think about that register of language. So, my top tip then to summarize, secondly, is thinking about the design of resources, the register of language and how they flow. Third and final thing then is just to hark back to our theme around adaptive teaching as our preferred approach in our setting. My third top tip, therefore, is to be ready with additional resources to deploy whenever you need them. So thinking about having things ready to go. So in our setting, it would be in what we call a files pod in our online classroom environment. We might have things curated, ready to go. We might have in a text pod, we might have, for learners to remind them, what's gone before in the lessons before and what's coming up next. We can sometimes find for SEND learners that can really ameliorate anxiety and really help them. So just some thoughtfulness about what we provide. In addition, ready to draw upon is my third and final tip.
Thanks, Ray. Always a delight hearing your top tips.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this episode of the Alternative Provision podcast. The full webinar is available on our website, academy21.co.uk, and within that you can also hear from Lakshmi, our Deputy Head of Science, who shares some visual examples of how we can support our learners with SEND on our platform. We hope you found today's episode helpful and taken away some of our top tips. Thanks, colleagues.